All right, and this is part two of evolution. Um, so, back to the driving factors of evolution, we have genetic drift, and this is how genes move throughout a population and change in a population over time. The first example of genetic drift is a bottleneck event, and this one is very important to you. A bottleneck happens when, for whatever reason, a large portion of the population dies out. And when they die out, you lose a lot of the genetic variety. So, in a normal system, we have generation one here, where I have 28 of these little beige colored individuals. When they reproduce, we get roughly close to about the same numbers. But during a bottleneck event, instead of drawing a large representation of that, we draw only a few individuals. And when they reproduce, I now have zero of my beige colored individuals that survived to that next generation. So when the population recovers and I get the normal number of individuals that should be in the population, that beige colored gene is gone. A big example of this for the human population was the bubonic plague, which killed a huge number of individuals in Asia and Europe during the Middle Ages. When that happened, so many of the human genome, or so many human genes were lost because so many people died. Humans, because we've gone through several bottleneck events through disease or war, are very, very genetically similar. Regardless of how different we all look, we have so many genes in common that we are more similar to each other than most species are. Most species exhibit a much wider range of genetic variability. Another example is the elephant seal. The northern elephant seal have a reduced genetic variation because they were hunted almost to extinction in the 1890s. At one point, they had as few as 20 surviving individuals in that population. When they finally were able to recover their numbers, now we're at about 30,000 individuals. Their genes still carry the bottleneck mark, where they are very, very similar to one another. In contrast, the southern elephant seal is much more variable in its genetic composition because it did not go through this big bottleneck event. The second form of genetic drift is called the founder effect. This happens when a small group of individuals is separated and founds a new population. So maybe for whatever reason it got caught in a storm, or it's separated somehow to a new island and founds a new population on this island. Another example of a founder effect is when a single genetic mutation arises in an area with little gene flow. Over time, that population has a higher occurrence of that new gene. So it's a genetic founder. Something new occurs. And if you click on this link when you have time, this is a published article from Nature that goes over a genetic variation that causes a disorder that is very, very common in Finland, but not very common elsewhere in the world because of a genetic founder effect, where that population is where the gene arose, and because there's very little movement between individuals in that population, the gene became amplified and is now quite common there. Gene flow, as I alluded to in the previous slide, is the movement of genes into or out of a gene pool. This results in a very slow spread of genes throughout a big population. So down here I have all beige colored beetles, but one of them moves into this population of beetles. This is the same species, and that's very important. They can still interbreed, and over a few generations, because this individual has moved, he is going to spread this gene throughout the population. So my new population of beetles will have a mixture of green and beige. Another driving force is selective mating. This is when individuals of a species choose their mates based on any kind of different criteria. Traits that are seen as favorable to mating tend to accumulate in that species gene pool. So it could be a coloration pattern, it could be a special dance, it could be a song, it could be having large antlers or large horns or big muscles. Whatever it is that the female of that species is looking for tends to be accentuated and exaggerated over a very long period of time. And then natural selection. This is one of the biggest driving factors behind evolution. This is the survival of the fittest theory. And it comes in 5 basic parts. First of all, natural variety exists in a population due to genetic differences. And remember that those differences arise because of mutation. Secondly, all members of a population struggle to survive. So not only do species compete with each other, competition within the same species or within the same population does exist, and they will fight with each other in order to pass on their genes. Third, genetic differences mean that some individuals survive at a higher rate than others, leading to more offspring. So if you are better fit for your survival or better fit in your niche, you will survive longer and therefore produce more offspring during your lifetime. Finally, favorable traits in that population accumulate and change the genetic makeup of the population. This is microevolution. The more offspring you produce that have those favorable traits, the more the population begins to look like the original that had those favorable traits. And I'll show you a picture of this in a second. And finally, if we look over a very, very long period of time, geologic time, those genetic changes that accumulate can lead to speciation, or making a new species. And that is macroevolution, large scale. Here's the example. If you look at time 1, I have an equally divided population of white mice versus gray mice with no predators. And in this situation, all of my mice can interbreed, and there is no preference to color. If I add a predator, my predator tends to pick off the mice it sees better, and you see he's picked up a little white mouse here. The white mice stand out more, so they are now less fit for their environment. And finally, after my second generation reproduces, my new generation of mice have very few whiter or lighter colored individuals because they are less fit for that environment. This is an example of microevolution. If it continues through hundreds of generations, eventually that white gene could be lost. And if other genetic differences are accumulated over time, I could end up with a brand new species of mouse. This is a picture of Charles Darwin. If you've never heard of Charles Darwin, we may need to do a little bit of research on him. Charles Darwin didn't ever actually attack how a new species arose. Instead, in his paper, in his published work on the origin of species by means of natural selection, Charles Darwin outlined the steps of natural selection and how it worked. He was very correct on most of his thoughts. Some things have been altered and changed through time and been perfected through science, but he was really the man that stepped forward and said that species do change, and this is how they change. He wasn't the first to say that change happens, but he was definitely the first to give us a specific outline of natural selection and how species were able to change to meet their environment. So there's a little quote by him. Let's see here. Macroevolution is what happens when species occurs. And I'll let you look at the little comic. Before we can look at speciation, we have to know what a species is. And it was first, it's been defined by many people, but we're going to go with the biological species concept, which was defined by Ernest Mayr. A species is a population whose members can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. And in this picture, we see humans. Even though each of these people looks drastically different, come from very different regions of the earth, and have very different cultural aspects, they are a member of the same species because they can reproduce. Reproductive compatibility is a huge factor in determining if a species is a separate species or a member of the same species. These guys, let's see if it's going to tell me, are both distinct species, the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark. And if you look, they look more similar to each other than any of the two people on the left. However, their songs and behaviors are different enough that these two individuals would never interbreed. They will not reproduce. when we think about how a species originates, there are several different evolutionary processes that happen. First of all, populations become isolated. That could be geographically or reproductively. In isolated populations, each population will evolve independently of each other. So if one species evolves in one direction, the other may go that same direction or it may do something different. Evolution is driven by the ecological forces around that species or around that population. Isolation, as we said, happens geographically or reproductively. Allopatric isolation is the name we give to geographic separation. That's what's happening in figure A here. These fish cannot interbreed because they are separated geographically. Sympatric means that my populations live in the same area but will not interbreed. That could be because of a reproductive pressure, like in this case, maybe the female fish only want to breed with species of or fish of the same color as them, so they might not interbreed even though they live in the same place. Geographic isolation, here's another example, can occur from a physical barrier, and that is an allopatric speciation. Once again, in this example, this little squirrel, let's see here, the antelope squirrel lives in the Grand Canyon, and he's just a few miles away from this little guy who lives on the north rim of the canyon, the white-tailed antelope squirrel. Even though these guys are very, very similar genetically, they are distinct species because they are separated by that physical barrier. There are many ways that pre-reproductive barriers exist. These are obstacles to mating or to fertilization if mating should ever occur. Geographic isolation, we've already looked at. This mountain range separates these two flowers. Ecological isolation, these two salamanders, or lizards, I can't tell by the look of them, exist in very different niches. This guy is going to be up in the trees, this one's down on the ground. Because they will never meet, they will not reproduce. Temporal isolation, the flower on the right is blooming in the spring while the flower on the left blooms in the wintertime. Because they do not release pollen at the same time, they will not be able to interbreed. Behavioral isolation, as we've seen before, because these two birds sing a different mating song, they will never be able to attract each other as mates. Mechanical isolation happens when you do not possess the actual mechanical structures to be able to have sex or to reproduce. Because even if these guys could reproduce genetically, they don't have the physiology to be able to. And gametic isolation. In this case, even if intercourse occurs or fertilization occurs, or if mating occurs, the gametes are not compatible, so the egg cannot be fertilized by this particular sperm. The rate of speciation is currently under debate. It's been under debate for a very long time. Does speciation happen gradually or is it a rapid succession? Gradualism was proposed by Charles Darwin and supported by Charles Lyell, and punctuated equilibrium, very heavily supported by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge. Gradualism means that there is a very gradual divergence over very long spans of time. So small morphological changes over a long period of time will very slowly separate this species of moth into two distinct species. It assumes that big changes occur as the accumulation of many small ones. So you can see over time there are very tiny little changes that lead to this new species, or two new species. Punctuated equilibrium, on the other hand, states that the rate of speciation is not constant at all, and instead is rapid bursts of change over short periods of time. Long periods of time go by with little or no change. And species undergo rapid change when they first bud from the parent population right here, and then remain fairly constant over time. It's likely that both of these forms occur at the same time, that some species go through punctuated equilibrium and gradualism, and it just depends on the ecological pressure. And we're going to have to continue to part 3.